Do you struggle with dry brushing? Do your models look like this?
Yes.
Well, no fear. All you need to do is call the DRPA.
Woohoo!
And by the end of this video, your miniatures are going to look like this. So what is dry brushing? Well, at its core, it's a technique that allows you to bring out all the textures and details on your miniatures really quickly and really easily. And it's done by setting up the paint in a particular way on a certain kind of brush that's got some spring to the bristles that allows you to flick the paint back and forth across your model so that paint just catches those raised areas. Now, when you're setting the paint up, you just need to make sure it is fairly dry on the brush by wiping away excess paint. And this is where the name comes from, because what you're doing is creating a dry brush before you apply it onto the miniature, because the paint on the brush is pretty much dry. So for it, what you'll need first of all is the right sort of brush, and there's lots of different varieties available, but the ones I like to use generally are sort of chisel points, but that's more personal preference because I like the control it gives in the direction as you apply it. So ones like this, the ones I tend to use. This is a large dry brush from Citadel, but this is by no means the only one you can use. For example, this sort of brush is becoming more and more popular. It's one from Artisopus, and you can see it's got a more rounded sort of end to it, which gives some benefits if you use it in particular ways. The key thing is that the bristles are nice and springy on both, and they're quite tough as well, which is necessary for the technique to work. Now, whilst you can pseudo dry brush with more fine regular sized brushes, it will make a mess of them if you're not careful. So I definitely recommend that you do not use your best brushes for this sort of thing. You want some dedicated dry brushes for this technique. So to do this, what you'll need is the right sort of paint. Regular acrylic is the best to go for here. It doesn't really work with washes or contrast paints or anything like that. You want something with a bit more strength to it. And also you'll want something to put it on, so a palette, and also you'll need something to wipe off the excess paint. Now, what I like to use here is some kitchen towel because it's nice and tough and it's got some texture on there so you can see what sort of result is going to happen on your miniature. But other options are available. You could, for example, use some of the textured MDF boards that are around these days. You could also get some spare pieces of plastic and wipe off paint on those. The choice really is yours, but if you're not sure, kitchen towel is a great place to start. So what I'm going to do now is show you an example of how this works and what it looks like using a piece of scenery that I've got from Warhammer 40,000. This is just a corridor wall from a spaceship scenery set that they've got, and you can see it's very textured, so this sort of thing is perfect for dry brushing. I've undercoated it black for a nice clear example. This is matte black from the Colour Forge, and what I'm going to do is dry brush it with some silver. And the silver I'm going to use here is some Surcoat silver. So to do this, what you need to do is get some of that silver onto your palette first of all, then get your brush, and here I'm using that large dry brush again, and just load up a small amount on the tip of the bristles. You don't need very much here. Then what you need is that material that you're going to be wiping off the excess paint on. So here I've got my kitchen towel, and what you do is rub it into the brush, then start moving your way along so that less and less paint appears on that paper. And when it's down to a small amount, such as this sort of point just here, then you're ready to go. And what you do is just start lightly brushing it back and forth across your miniature or your scenery. So you can see the flicking motion I do here. Just go back and forth, and it allows the paint to catch those raised up details and textures and helps them pop out really nicely. Now, by playing around with the pressure that you do here, you can actually get some interesting different results. So actually it's got a lot of applications here. If we go around to a door and start pressing really heavily, you'll see what happens is the paint tends to collect on the flatter areas instead of just the corners, giving a sort of kind of layering in a way. It's a little bit rougher than layering and not quite as controlled, but you can see the result is that that black stays in the recesses and gives some shading. So by playing around with it, you can actually get some really interesting effects on your miniatures. And here we have the result. You can see by being quite heavy with the brush, that silver becomes really dominant, but we still have the black in the recesses. And if we compare it to the other side, where we were quite light, you can see here it's worked as a highlight. So still dry brushing for both these techniques, but it results in some quite different appearances, meaning this is really handy when painting your miniatures. So what we'll do now is look at some of this in practice on a Space Marine miniature from Games Workshop. And the example I've got is just here. So far what I've done with this model is undercoat it with some Macragge blue, and then I put Oblivion black wash all over it for some shading. The base I've got painted grey just to help separate him from it a little bit, but the plan here now is to re-establish the blue and then to highlight him with a lighter blue by just using dry brushing. So what I'm going for first of all is a blue similar to Macragge blue. I've got some marine blue here, and to apply this one, whilst I am dry brushing it, I'm doing it with a small dry brush this time. One of the ones from Citadel here, because he's still got a chisel point on there. It's a good sort of size for this sort of thing, and just like with that silver, what you do is load up a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush. Then I'm going to be using some of the kitchen towel once again, and with this I'm just going to work it into the brush and then make my way across, just like before, getting rid of that excess paint, working it into the bristles until we're down to around about this sort of strength just here. So now we're ready to start applying it. And all we've got to do is start putting it on quite heavily like we did with that silver. So you can see roughly what the brush looks like just there. And the kind of pressure I'm going to be putting on is to go more or less like that, but in a rounded motion. And by doing this, what we'll do is just really get that blue dominant on the flat areas of the armor. But because of the motion, it's not falling into the recesses. So you can see dry brushing, but it's just re-establishing that initial blue across the armor. Here we have the result of applying it in that quite heavy way. You can see it's really got that main blue re-established on the miniature, so now we can move on to a lighter blue. Here I'm using Elysium blue, again set up as a dry brush, but this time I'm going for that more light flicking motion, and the result is the colour catches the edges and corners on the armour, giving it a nice highlight. As you can see, doing this is really quick and really easy to do, but the brush is touching the model at a much lighter pressure than before. By pause it, you can see it's just gently grazing it like that, because this way you ensure you only catch the corners. Now, if you're new to the hobby and you're looking to learn more techniques like this, then what you should do is check out DuncanRhodes.com, which is our home on the internet and is packed full of all sorts of painting tutorial videos, including our full course teaching the fundamentals of miniature painting. This is in addition to our enormous library of videos, well over 400, covering all kinds of different techniques, but also fully painting miniatures too, covering every step that you need to know to paint the miniature from start to finish. Each miniature we paint also features now a reference gallery, so you can see in detail all the parts we painted and in what colours. And we have a giveaway too, and this is all based around our community of painters who are all learning to paint their miniatures too. You can access all of this and more for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, so be sure to go and check it out. And here we have the result of applying that lighter blue and that lighter flicking motion. Instead of catching the flat parts of the miniature, instead it's caught all the edges and corners, giving it a really nice highlight. That was done very quickly and very easily. So at the core of it, that's all you need to know about dry brushing really to get a good result with it. Remember, it's all about making sure, first of all, you're using the right sort of brushes. You want ones that are quite robust, that have a good bit of spring in the bristles, and then you want to use regular acrylic paints and set them up correctly. You need some sort of textured surface to work the paint into the brush and then remove the excess. And as you've seen, I like to use kitchen towel for this, but there's all kinds of different things you can use. Just as long as it's got some texture and it can get rid of excess paint, you'll be absolutely fine. Then when you're ready and you start applying it to the miniature, varying how much pressure you put on it will get some different results as you've seen here. So definitely experiment with it because it's a very, very useful technique to have in your arsenal. So now that we've looked at how to dry brush, we're going to cover 3 of the most common mistakes I see when people are starting to do this for the first time. And the first mistake is that people simply leave too much paint on the brush. As you've seen in preparing for this, what you should do is really work the paint into the bristles and then remove loads of it so that hardly any is left there. And this way, when you apply it to the miniature, you have a degree of control because the more time you spend on an area, the stronger the colour is going to be, meaning you can build it up in a nice controlled fashion to get exactly what you want. Now, if you have too much paint on your brush, basically things go wildly out of control straight away and it looks horrible. So I'll show you what I mean now with another Space Marine for the example. This time what I have is a Primaris Space Marine and I've got him ready in the same way as I was doing for the previous example. So he's been undercoated with Macragge Blue spray, I then washed him with Oblivion Black wash, and I have already dry brushed him quite heavily using Marine Blue. So now I'm going to move on to that second dry brush, the light one, looking for the highlights here using Elysium Blue. And to do it, I am using my small dry brush once again from Citadel, and what I'm going to do is just load up this time with a bit too much paint, get some tissue, work it in a bit there like that, and then go straight away. And well, what happens is immediately we'll get way too much paint being deposited on the model. You see, it just kind of really ruins everything. Now, this is quite an obvious example, but even so, it's not impossible to fix it. All you have to do is just let that dry and go back to the original colour that you had underneath it. So in this case, that would be Marine Blue. And basically what you do is just reapply that carefully, and once that's dry, try the dry brushing again. But just remember to really make sure you work the paint into the bristles and get rid of loads of it until hardly anything is left. The second most common mistake I see when people are learning to dry brush is simply not making sure they've got the brush ready for the next colour when they're dry brushing with multiple colours. Because whilst you need to wash your brush, you also need to make sure it is completely dry before you move on to that next colour, else things do go wrong. And to illustrate that, I'm once again going to be dry brushing a Space Marine. Now this model has again gone through the same process, undercoated with Macragge Blue, washed Oblivion Black, and now I'm dry brushing him using Marine Blue. And you can see this is going absolutely fine, the colour's building up nicely, I'm happy with that, so we're now ready to move on to the lighter colour with some Elysium Blue. So what we need to do is set this up, and the first stage is of course to wash the brush, but once you've done so you should make sure you thoroughly dry it, because if you don't, when you load up your paint for the next stage and start working it in, you can see already things look a little bit weird on the tissue paper, and then when you start to apply it to the model, well, what you'll get is this quite unpleasant sort of like watery, streaky appearance, and because the paint's so watery, it starts to run into recesses and things. Now, in this situation, basically it's never going to work. It doesn't look right at all. Basically, it's just a matter of letting it dry and starting again. And if you do find you get any of the colour really settling in the corners, you just need to go back to some of your wash beforehand and then just run that into that corner, clean it all up, and then you can carry on. The thing to do is just to make sure you do thoroughly clean your brush between stages. And the way to do that with the dry brush is just to give it a good wash. So you rinse out the colour, then get some tissue and just make sure you roll the brush like this to absorb away as much water as possible. Now what I do once I've got to about this point here and not much else seems to be coming out of it, I then start to actually push the water out of the brush there like that by just rubbing downwards on it on both sides and just feeling it until it's dry. You can run it between your fingers there like that, but basically keep on going at it until it feels completely bone dry. Then you're ready to set up and do the dry brush for the next stage. The final common mistake we're going to take a look at is actually not with the dry brushing itself, but rather in the preparation of the miniatures. Because when you're building your models, you should always endeavour to remove any mould lines you may have on there. And also you want to make sure that you remove any excess plastic that appears where the components were connected to their sprues. Now, if you don't do this when you paint your miniatures, these things will show up, but especially so when you're dry brushing, because dry brushing doesn't distinguish between these and also the actual detail that you're looking to highlight. Now, to prove this, I have once again got a Space Marine who's been prepared in the exact same way. Again, undercoat of blue, wash black, and then I've already dry brushed in with marine blue. I'm now going to be dry brushing a highlight on there using Elysium blue using my small dry brush. And I have got this nice and dry and ready, and I'm going to prepare it correctly this time by really working the paint into the brush and then removing lots of it, bringing it all the way down to around about this sort of strength is good, you see, so quite weak there on the tissue paper. And then we're ready to start applying it. And now on this miniature, well, I've not removed any mould lines as I was building him, and I also was a little bit cavalier, you might say, when it comes to cutting the parts off the frames. Because when I start dry brushing, you can see that mould line on top of the helmet. Well, the dry brush starts to pick that out really strongly just there. Same as these little bits of the, well, these little nubs that we got from the sprue. It really starts to pick those out too, and you can see it just really, really exaggerates them. Again, we've got a mould line running across the top of the backpack that starts coming out just there. We've got a little burr on the side of this one which stands out, and on this miniature too, we do have mould lines running down the middle of the legs, and if we start dry brushing around here, well, you can see they're starting to pop out there as well. Now, the only way to avoid this is just to make sure that you clean up the miniature correctly before you start painting it, which means removing those mould lines, which you can do with a file, or you can do it with a knife, as long as you're careful. Remember, if you're a youngster, get an adult to do that for you. But also, where you remove the components from the frames, just make sure to remove that excess plastic too, and just gently file it down so it's nice and smooth. And if you do that, you'll find that dry brushing doesn't pick out any little mistakes like that at all. In this video, we've looked a lot at the core aspects of dry brushing, and now you have all the knowledge you need to get some great results with it. But actually, it's a very large subject with all sorts of interesting things that you can explore. And something that's becoming more and more popular these days is actually quite an interesting way of applying a dry brush by introducing a tiny bit of moisture into it and using some particular kinds of brushes. And the result is that you can build up some really smooth gradients that almost look like it's been airbrushed. Now, it takes a little bit of practice to get this right, but once you mastered it, it's actually a very useful thing to know. And to do it, what you'll need first of all is the right kind of brush for it. Now, normally this sort of thing is done with these rounded dry brushes like we saw earlier. I've got two different sizes just here. I'm going to be using the smaller one for this example here to dry brush on a cloak. As you've seen so far, dry brushing works best when you're doing really heavily textured areas, but sometimes you might want to do it on a large smooth area, and cloaks are a great example of that. So for our example miniature just here, I have a cloak on the back of this Stormcast Eternal miniature just here. Now, the cloak has so far just been base coated using some Berserker red, so a nice deep red, and I plan to dry brush a red and orange over the top of that to get some highlights on there. And to do this, we need to set things up correctly, which involves getting that little bit of moisture in the brush. Now, the set I've got for doing this is actually quite a nice one that comes with this little tub just here that's got a piece of sponge in it, but you don't need something fancy like this. Just a piece of sponge will be absolutely fine, and what you need to do is introduce a very small amount of water to it. So to do this, a great way to do it is actually to use the back of your brush. Just dip it into some water, so you've got some on there. Just dot it in the middle of the sponge there like that, and then with a finger, just start poking it into the sponge like that, so it's just a bit more distributed around. This then becomes your little pot for getting the right amount of water into your brush as you set things up. Now, the next thing you're going to need is some sort of surface to wipe away the excess paint that isn't going to soak away all that moisture. So what I like to use here is some laminated cardboard. Having it white is useful for seeing the colour nice and clear, but it can have a print on if you want, but white is best for this sort of thing. There are other things you can use, but this is going to be great for stopping that water from disappearing as we get things going. But aside from that, it's just like dry brushing like normal, really. Now the colour I'm going for here is some Sanguine Scarlet, and I've got my small dry brush here. What you do is start out by getting a bit of that moisture in your brush there like that, and then you get some of the paint on the brush, and then on your pad you just start working it into the brush like normal and removing the excess, and you really want to keep quite going at it until there's not much left on there. So you can see I'm really removing that excess paint, really getting rid of all that extra that we don't need until we're getting down to around about this sort of strength just here. So with that reached, we can then start applying it, and really it's like dry brushing as normal, just focusing really towards the parts that would catch the light, such as this part of the cloak just here. Now, because the paint's quite weak and it has that moisture in it, that first pass is going to be, well, quite weak, as you can see. It's not really jumping out too much, but you can see a bit of that red is catching that raised up area just there. I'm going to skip past that recess and apply a little bit around here and a little bit down here, and also I want to leave this bit in shadow, so I'm just going to pass there and start applying it in this region just here. But it will dry pretty quickly, which means you can then go back for a second coat to build it up a little bit further, so just around here. And really it's just a matter of building this up until that red becomes the dominant colour in these raised up regions. So I'm just going to keep on carrying on now until we get a nice strong red on these raised up parts. And here you can see by building up that colour, it gives a very pleasing result there, giving that a nice smooth gradient as the cloak goes into shadow around there. Now from this point on, you can take it further if you want to, using some lighter colours, and that's what I'm going to do now by adding another dry brush here, and I'm going to go for some Centurion Red, so quite an orange, sort of punchy red. But to do this, just like with any dry brushing, what you should do is get the brush ready again. So I have completely cleaned it, and I've also dried it as well, and that is important, even though we are putting that little bit of moisture in there, is because you need to bring it back to that starting point to make sure you have the correct amount on there, because it's very easy to overdo it. But we are ready to go, so again I'm just going to get a little bit of it there on the brush, and then here's some Centurion Red. I'm going to set this up just in the same way. So a bit of paint on the tip of the brush, start working it into the bristles, gradually moving along this pad just here until we're down to quite a weak strength. So I'm just going to keep on going until it's at about this sort of point here, and then we can start applying it just like before. And I'm going to be slightly more selective now, just focusing a little bit more towards areas where we would catch the light. So for example, in the central part just here, I'm just softly brushing it on there like that, and this outer part just here too. And here we have the result, and you can see by building up the colour in that way, we get that nice smooth gradient between all the various tones. So ideal for large smooth surfaces like a cloak, such as on this miniature. Now really this is just scratching the surface of this kind of technique, and with time and practice you can gain some phenomenal results out of it. So I definitely encourage you to look into it. But as you probably noticed by now, dry brushing is great for large open areas, but it's quite difficult to use it on focused details because the nature of the application means you're going to be catching surrounding areas and staining them with paint. Now what I tend to do with miniatures, if I'm going to be dry brushing them, is I front load it with all the dry brushing early on, so I can make sure all that's done, then I clean up with the smaller details later on. But sometimes that won't quite work out based upon the nature of how the model's put together, such is the case with an example I've got just here with a Chaos Warrior. Now you can see this warrior has had the armour painted in quite an elaborate way, but when it comes to painting a smaller area such as the fur around the shoulders, that's perfect for dry brushing because it's so heavily textured, but it's going to be just about impossible to dry brush that normally without catching that armour and messing it up. So what can you do? Well, there is a way of dry brushing with this using a regular brush, and I know I said you should make sure you use a particular kind of brush for it, but it's a good idea to have an older, more medium-sized brush on hand for this sort of thing, because it can be useful for it so long as you set it up in the right way. But also definitely don't use your good brushes for this, because over time it will wreck them. So I like to keep a cheap old brush for this sort of thing. The one I'm currently using for it is actually an old medium layer brush that I used to use quite a lot. You can see it's still holding a fairly good point on it, and what we're doing with this is setting up like a dry brush, but as I mentioned, in quite a specific way. Now so far the fur on that cloak has been Ancient Forest as a base coat, and I've washed it with some Battle Mud wash to give it some shading. And for the highlight I'm going to dry brush it using some sandstone, and for this what you should do is start out by just getting some of the paint onto this brush, just being sure to roll it in it so that the paint goes part way up it there like that. Then get some tissue, just like normal with dry brushing, but this time for the setup, go sideways back and forth like this. Don't go downwards like that because you'll start to fray out the bristles, but if you do it like this, you'll remove the excess paint, but loosely keep them together as well. Now there won't be a sharp point on there, but it will be sort of like a bullet tip on there, which is all we need really, because with the bristles holding together like that, it means we have some accuracy. And so long as you approach at an angle like this, looking to go down the length of the fur, you can actually just brush across it like this, and you can see this way we are dry brushing it, but it's really easy to control and keep it off that surrounding armour. And here we have the result of picking out that fur with that method. And you can see I've been able to dry brush it effectively without catching any of that surrounding armor in the process. So that's a really handy technique to know whenever you're dry brushing in a confined space. It's not so good in large areas, but in little parts like this, it's absolutely perfect. Now, if you think about these two methods we just looked at, they're interesting in that they kind of bend the rules that we laid down early on. The first one, for example, we allowed a little bit of moisture to get into the brush. And for this second one, we didn't use a dry brush at all, but instead just a regular sort of brush and set it up in a particular way. The point of this is to get across that really dry brushing is a really big subject. And there's lots of things that you can do to bend the rules and play around with it to get some interesting results. And I really do encourage you to explore it and experiment and see what you can come up with. Now, dry brushing is a great technique for all kinds of miniatures, and whilst in this video we did use some smaller ones for our examples, it's also fantastic for big models, particularly large creatures like monsters. If you're ever intimidated by something like that, you definitely want to have a go at dry brushing it, because, for example, this miniature here, Roticus, we dry brushed almost all of his body to really bring out all the texture and details, and it made it really quick to do, and it also looks fantastic as well. So definitely make sure that you keep it in your arsenal and use it, because you'll find it really makes the painting experience much more enjoyable. So we really hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it, and we'll see you again very soon.